Hey everyone, so what I want to do in this tutorial is talk a little bit more about what I do if I have to bring in someone else's topo, like an engineer, and the mesh is just unusable. I kind of started to touch on it in the last tutorial, but I didn't really tell you what to do or how to handle it. You don't necessarily have to bring it outside of Max. That's an option, but another option is to use the Conform to Mesh tool. So before I do that, though, I wanted to talk briefly about bringing stuff into Max. So I have a plane over here essentially that I moved way off into space, and I did that deliberately because this is what happens a lot of times when you're bringing in models. They're way, they're so far away from the origin that you don't even know where the origin of the scene is anymore once you bring it in. This is bad because it screws up the way that Max handles local manipulations to an object, like when you're modeling, because you're so far away from the scene origin and the system unit scale isn't set to handle it because the scene gets too big. This is especially true when you start working on larger sites. So a really easy fix for that is just to right click on it, open up this move transform, and then zero out the spinners, and then that will reset the location to 000. I usually do this anytime I'm starting a new scene. I like to work at the origin, unless it's like a file link or something like that. Okay, so what do we have in this scene? So we have, this is just a rectangle that I drew, and instead of creating an edit poly on top of that or trying to subdivide it, I put this garment maker modifier on it instead, for the simple purpose of illustrating what it might look like whenever you're working with a dim or someone else's topo. So the point being, this is like less than ideal, and you're not going to be able to cut into this mesh very well. So using that and then applying a turbo smooth modifier a few times, and then displacing it with an image that I found online, this guy here, we basically have a site now that has, you know, obviously an exaggerated amount of elevation change. And all we want to do for this exercise is take this mesh and make it clean. So what you can do is go into your top viewport and create a plane that doesn't quite overlap that geometry. You really don't want it to overlap. It's not a big deal if it does, but just something that fits inside of that window. Okay, and then you want to move that plane up so that it's higher than the mesh that you want to wrap it to, and then go back into your top viewport again, select compound object, conform, pick wrap to object, and you're going to select this guy that it forms your base mesh. Now keep in mind, you want to make sure that this use active viewport is selected, or you can use any object z-axis. By default, neither one of these are on. So just make sure and check that. Otherwise, it's going to be projecting based on a perspective view or an ortho view, and you're going to get a bad result. So that's on. Now we can select it. Depending on how dense the mesh is, it may or may not take a little bit of time. So essentially what it just did is it attached it to the mesh below. So if I put an edit poly modifier on there and I select element, I can then pull that off. I could detach it, I could do whatever I wanted, but just so you can see, that's the original and that's the new. Actually, it created two objects. This is essentially the original, and then it gives you a duplicate and a revised version of this. So, you know, if this plane had been denser, it would have conformed much nicer, but that's how you could go in and rebuild that mesh. You can see it hasn't changed any of the edge loops as far as their orientation in the X and the Y. It's only distorted them along the Z axis, and this would be just perfect for receiving a shape merge.